A sign on the door said, "Staff entrance," not staff and visitors, not alternative access, just staff entrance, handwritten in marker, on a piece of tape that someone had stuck there years ago and never bothered to remove. Theodora Obi read it twice, and she looked at the main entrance, 20 feet to her left, where the other applicants were walking in, resumes in hand, shoulders squared. And she understood exactly what the receptionist had meant when she smiled and said, "That door there, sweetheart." Dora was 26 years old. She had a master's degree in financial forensics from Georgetown. She had spent 3 years as a junior analyst at a firm in Baltimore that had since been acquired by the very company she was now standing outside of. She carried her folder of documents the way her mother had taught her. Flat, not rolled, never bent at the corners. She walked to the staff entrance. She opened the door. She stepped inside. Always smelled like cleaning solution and old carpet. A security guard glanced up from his phone and pointed her toward the elevator without being asked, the way people point at things they've been pointing at for years. She took the elevator to the 14th floor. She found the conference room. She sat down in the last open chair, the one closest to the door, the one that wobbled slightly when she shifted her weight. There were 11 other candidates in the room. She was the only black woman. She had known she would be. Position was Senior Risk Analyst at Hartwell Capital Management. It was, by any reasonable measure, the kind of job that didn't get posted publicly. It got passed along from a partner to his brother-in-law, from a golf buddy to a college roommate. The fact that Theodora had even found the listing was the result of 6 months of deliberate searching, 2 informational interviews she'd had to talk her way into, and 1 quiet tip from a former professor who'd said, "They're being pressured to expand the candidate pool, so apply now before they change their minds." Applied. She had been called. She was here. The man who entered the room at precisely 9 o'clock was Edmund Farrell, Director of Risk Strategy. He had the kind of posture that came from 40 years of being listened to. He didn't introduce himself. He simply set his portfolio on the table, looked around the room and said, "We're going to do something a little different today." He placed a single sheet of paper in front of each candidate. Dora looked at hers. It was a case study, a mid-sized regional bank, 2008, certain derivatives exposure, a sequence of internal memos going back 14 months before the collapse. The question at the bottom read, "Identify where the failure originated. Be specific. You have 20 minutes." Around the table, people uncapped pens. Someone laughed quietly and said, "Okay then." Dora didn't laugh. She read the memo sequence twice. Then she read it a 3rd time, but this time she read it backwards, chronologically reversed. Because that was how her professor at Georgetown had taught her to look at failures. You don't find the origin by following the disaster forward. You find it by asking what had to be true before the first domino fell. She wrote for 19 minutes, without stopping. Edmund Farrell collected the papers himself. He didn't use the intern who had been hovering by the door. He walked to each seat, picked up each sheet, glanced at it briefly, the glance of someone who already knew what most of them would say, and moved on. Reached Theodora. He picked up her paper. He read it. He did not move on. Candidate beside her shifted in his seat. Someone coughed. Edmund Farrell stood at Theodora's chair and read her paper the way you read something when you're trying to find the error and can't find it. So, you read it again. I set it back down. He looked at her. "Where did you train?" he said. "Georgetown, financial forensics." She paused. "And I spent 3 years at Meridian Analytics before they were acquired." "Acquired by us." "Yes." Opened up her paper again. He walked back to the front of the room. He said nothing else. He collected the remaining sheets without glancing at them. Callbacks came 2 days later. Theodora's name was on the list, so were 4 others. She drove to the Hartwell building on a Tuesday morning in October, parked in the visitor structure, and took the main entrance this time. Not because anyone had told her to, but because no one had told her not to. The second interview was with Edmund Farrell and two other partners, a woman named Constance Hale, who handled institutional clients, and a man named Burton Marsh, who had co-founded the firm 31 years ago and still came in every day even though he no longer had to. Burton was 74 years old. He wore a tie with small anchors on it. Had the look of a man who had made a great deal of money by being right slightly more often than everyone around him, and who had never fully forgiven the people who had been right when he was wrong. They sat across from Theodora in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. Constance Hale asked her about her methodology. Theodora answered. Constance nodded and wrote something down. Burton Marsh asked her where she'd gone to undergrad. Pullman College, Theodora said. Burton tilted his head. Is that down in Atlanta? Yes. He wrote something down, or pretended to. His pen didn't move. And your family? Are they in finance? My mother is a nurse. My father drove trucks until he retired. Burton looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at Constance. Constance looked at Theodora. That's admirable, Burton said, in the tone that people use when they mean something else entirely. Theodora placed her hands flat on the table. Her grandmother had told her, once that hands give everything away. They shake when you're scared. They grip when you're angry. They fidget when you're ashamed. Her grandmother had told her to practice keeping them still. And she kept them still. I'd like to walk you through my analysis of the Meridian portfolio transition, she said. If you have 12 minutes, I think it's relevant to what Hartwell is trying to build in the next cycle. Burton Marsh opened his mouth. Edmund Farrell said, go ahead. Went ahead. She used no notes. She had spent 11 years building the habit of knowing her material the way you know the layout of your own home. Not because you've memorized it, but because you've moved through it so many times that your feet know where to go, even in the dark. Walk them through the Meridian transition, the inherited risk positions, the misaligned hedges, the $12 million correction that the senior analysts had missed and that she had flagged in a memo that her supervisor had filed without responding to, until 6 weeks later when the numbers proved her right, and suddenly the memo mattered very much. Constance Hale leaned forward about halfway through. Ape. Burton Marsh stopped pretending to write and started actually listening. Edmund Farrell watched her the whole time with an expression that wasn't quite readable. Not warm, not cold, but careful. The way you watch something when you're trying to decide whether it's as good as it appears or whether you're being fooled by your own surprise at finding it. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. And Burton Marsh said, that memo you mentioned, did you keep a copy? I have the full documentation. I'd like to see it. I can have it to you by end of day. Nodded. He wrote something down for real this time. Theodora didn't look at what it was. And she sent the documentation that evening from her kitchen table while a pot of rice cooked on the stove. She had learned to work at the kitchen table because her apartment had no desk, and she had learned not to think of this as a deficit. Because her mother had worked at the kitchen table her entire life and had raised 2 children and put them both through college doing it. At send, she ate dinner. She did not wait by her phone. Days passed. On the 4th day, Edmund Farrell emailed her directly, not through the HR coordinator, not through the scheduling system. His email address, his name in the from field, his words. Ms. Obi, would you be available Thursday at 2 o'clock? There's something we'd like to discuss. I read the email once. She closed her laptop. She called her mother. Emailed me, she said. Hey, what kind of email? A kind where they use your last name. Her mother said nothing for a moment. Then, "What are you going to wear?" Thursday at 2 o'clock, Edmund Farrell met her in the lobby. Not the receptionist, not the HR coordinator. Edmund himself in the lobby, which was a signal. She had learned long ago to read the architecture of professional encounters. Who meets you and where tells you almost everything before a single word is spoken. He shook her hand. He did not smile exactly, but his voice was warmer than it had been. "Want to offer you the position," he said. "But there's a conversation we need to have first, about scope." I followed him to a conference room on the 12th floor, not the 14th, where the group interview had been, but a smaller room with a round table and no view of the river. Burton Marsh was there. So was Constance Hale. There was also a fourth person she hadn't met, a man named Arthur Dempsey, who was, Edmund explained, the head of compliance. Something shifted in the room's atmosphere when she walked in. She felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather comes. Sat down. She kept her hands flat on the table. Arthur Dempsey opened a folder. He said, "We've reviewed your meridian analysis, all of it, including some materials our own acquisition team processed when we absorbed the firm." I slid a document across the table. It was a risk assessment. It had Hartwell's letterhead. It was dated 18 months ago. It was also, she realized as she read the first page, substantially wrong. Not wrong in a small way, wrong in a way that would have consequences, was already having consequences. She suspected if she looked at the right corner of the right portfolio. Looked up from the document. "Who authored this?" Arthur Dempsey cleared his throat. He looked at Burton. "That's internal." I'm asking, because the methodology in Section 3 contradicts the Basel III framework in a way that would have been caught in a standard compliance review. She set the document flat. "I'm not asking to be difficult. I'm asking because if I'm joining this team, I need to understand what the current exposure is." Her room was quiet. Burton Marsh looked at Edmund Farrell. Edmund Farrell looked at the document. And he looked at Theodora. "Exposure," he said slowly, "is why we're offering you the position." She didn't accept on the spot. Her mother had taught her that too. When someone offers you something valuable, you don't grab. You consider. You make them wait one day, so they understand that you know your worth. She took 24 hours. Called her former professor at Georgetown, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wren, who had spent 40 years watching talented analysts walk into rooms they weren't expected to survive and come out the other side. Theodora explained the situation. Dr. Wren listened without interrupting, a habit so rare in Theodora's experience that she always noticed it, always felt the particular quality of attention it created. Theodora finished. Dr. Wren said, "Do you trust your own read on the exposure?" Yes. And the question isn't whether to take the job. The question is what you need in writing before you do. Negotiate it. Not loudly, not combatively. She made a list of what she required. Scope of authority, documentation access, a direct reporting line to Edmund, rather than through a layer of senior analysts who would have every incentive to minimize what she found. She sent the list to Edmund's email address at 8 in the morning. He responded by noon. They went back and forth 3 times. On the 4th exchange, he wrote, "Agreed, all of it. When can you start?" She started on a Monday in November. Her badge had her photograph and her full title, Senior Risk Analyst, Portfolio Integrity. It was a title that hadn't existed at Hartwell before she arrived. Edmund had created it in the 2 weeks between her acceptance and her start date. Found this out from the administrative coordinator, a woman named Agnes, who had been at Hartwell for 19 years and had a way of delivering information that was simultaneously casual and precise. Agnes showed her to her office, an actual office, with a door on the 12th floor, and said, While arranging a small plant on the windowsill that she'd apparently brought from her own desk, he hasn't made a new title in 11 years. Last time was for Marcus Webb, and Marcus turned out to be right about everything. "What happened to Marcus?" Theodora asked. "He runs the Singapore office now." Agnes left the plant on the windowsill and walked out without further comment. The first thing Theodora did in her new office was read every risk assessment Hartwell had produced in the past 4 years. All of them. She requested the files through Agnes, who delivered them in 3 stacked boxes without asking why or looking surprised. It took her 11 days. What she found was not a catastrophe. Catastrophes, in her experience, were rare. They were the dramatic endpoint of 100 smaller decisions that had each seemed reasonable in isolation. What she found was a pattern. A consistent methodology applied across certain classes of derivative instruments that overstated stability by a factor she calculated at between 8 and 12%, depending on market conditions. A portfolio the size of Hartwell's, that margin was not small. He wrote a report. 41 pages. She included every data source, every calculation, every reference framework. She did not soften the language. She had learned from the Meridian memo that had sat in a filing system for 6 weeks that softening language is a form of optimism that the numbers never share. Yet, she brought it to Edmund on a Friday afternoon. Read the executive summary while she sat across from him. She had timed it before. 3 minutes 40 seconds if you read carefully. She counted. At 3 minutes 50, he turned to page 2. Read for another 20 minutes. She sat quietly. Outside his window, the river was gray-green and moving fast. She watched it. When he finished, he closed the report. He looked at it for a moment. The look of someone measuring the distance between what they'd suspected and what they now knew. "How long?" he said. "A pattern starts in 2019. And exposure if we rebalance now versus. I've modeled 3 scenarios. They're in section 4. The best case window is about 90 days. Looked at her. "You've been here 11 days. Our files were accessible." It was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to loop in Burton." I know. I was not going to like this. I know." I stood up. He picked up the report. He walked to the door and stopped. He turned around. "For what it's worth," he said, "Marcus Webb said the same thing when he delivered his first report, almost word for word." He paused. "He was right, too." Left. She stayed by the window and watched the river. Meeting with Burton Marsh happened on a Monday. Constance Hale was there. Arthur Dempsey was there. 2 other senior partners she hadn't met were there. A woman named Frances Birch, who handled endowment accounts, and a man named Oliver Steed, who had a reputation for asking questions designed to reveal the limits of whoever was answering them. Dora had read everything they'd ever published internally. She was ready for Oliver Steed. They started early. Before the report had even been formally introduced, he said, "I understand you've been with us under 2 weeks. Is that right?" 11 working days, yes. In 11 days, you've found a systemic flaw that our compliance department, our senior analysts, and our external auditors have all, in your assessment, missed. Said, in your assessment, the way people say it, when they mean in your opinion, which I've already decided is wrong. I've found a methodological pattern, she said. Whether it constitutes a flaw is something the data answers, not me. She opened her copy of the report to section 4. If you'd like to look at the scenario modeling, I can walk you through the assumptions. Any of them. Oh, any of them. Any of them. Oliver Steed looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the report. Then, slowly, he looked at the report the way you look at something when you've been trained your whole career to be skeptical and you're being asked to override that instinct, and you're not sure yet whether the override is wisdom or surrender. Picked up his copy. He turned to section 4. As Frances Birch had been reading since the meeting started, she turned to page 31 and said, without looking up, "The correlation you've drawn between the 2021 stress test results and the current positions, can you show me the raw calculation? I can pull it up now." Please do." Meeting ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. By the end, Burton Marsh had not apologized. He was not the kind of man who apologized. But he had stopped looking at Theodora the way he'd looked at her in that first interview, the look of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the ritual to conclude. He was looking at her differently now, with the focused, slightly reluctant attention of someone who has just realized the room has changed and he didn't see it happen. "They'll need an external review," he said finally. "I've already identified 3 firms qualified to conduct it. The referrals are in the appendix." She paused. Page 39. Turn to page 39. Oliver Steed made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Frances Birch turned another page. Edmund Farrell, who had said almost nothing for 2 hours, looked at Theodora from across the table with an expression that was, she realized, relief. Not the relief of someone whose burden has been lifted. The relief of someone who had made a bet on an instinct and found out, finally, that the instinct was right. External review confirmed her findings. It took 6 weeks. The adjusting firm they brought in to manage the rebalancing was one of the 3 she had listed on page 39. The process was not seamless. There were uncomfortable conversations with institutional clients. There were 2 senior analysts who'd authored the original assessments and who did not find the experience of being corrected a pleasant one. There were weeks where Theodora walked into rooms that went quiet in a particular way. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had too much to say and had decided not to. Walked through those rooms the way she had learned to walk through every room that had been designed, consciously or not, to make her feel she didn't belong in it. She walked like someone who has already paid the price of entry and doesn't need to justify it again. Agnes brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked, which Theodora understood as a form of endorsement. In February, Edmund Farrell called her into his office and told her that the board had formally approved a new compliance framework based on her methodology. They were calling it the OBI protocol internally, which was his decision. He said it the same way he said most things, directly, without ceremony, as though he were reading a weather report. Dora looked at him. "Don't have to call it that," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "We're calling it that." Went back to her office. She sat at her desk. She looked at the plant Agnes had put on her windowsill, which had grown visibly since November, reaching now toward the glass in a way that was either instinct or something that looked enough like it to matter. I thought about the staff entrance, the marker on tape sign, the elevator that smelled like cleaning solution. She thought about sitting in the chair that wobbled. He thought about her mother at the kitchen table, her father on the road, Dr. Patricia Wren listening without interrupting. The $12 million Meridian memo that sat in a filing system for 6 weeks before anyone with authority decided it was worth reading. Opened her laptop. She had a new report to write. Window was there. The river was gray-green and moving fast. The plant reached toward the glass, and Theodora Obi, Senior Risk Analyst, Portfolio Integrity, Hartwell Capital Management, began to type. Some people enter through the front door. Some are handed a piece of tape on a back hallway wall and told, without words, that this is where they belong. The story doesn't end at the door. It ends at what you do once you're inside, and what you refuse to let stand once you understand, fully, just how much has been hidden from the people who were supposed to see it. Dora saw it. She wrote it down. She made them look. I keep thinking about that piece of tape on the back door. Marker on white tape, stuck there by someone who never expected anyone to question it. That's the thing about systems built on assumption. They don't announce themselves. They just stand there, looking permanent, waiting to see if you'll walk past without reading the sign. Adora didn't walk past. She read it twice, and then she went inside anyway. I've thought a long time about what it actually takes to do what she did. Not the dramatic version, not the movie version, where someone slams a folder on a table and walks out to applause. The real version, one where you sit in an office for 11 days reading boxes of documents that nobody asked you to read, because you know something is wrong, and you know that knowing something is wrong only matters if you can prove it on paper, completely, without gaps. That's not stubbornness. That's something harder to name and harder to build. It's the willingness to do the unglamorous work, the counting, the verifying, the writing and rewriting, even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. Theodora didn't flag a 41-page finding because she wanted recognition. She did it because the numbers were the numbers, and she wasn't willing to pretend otherwise. There's a kind of moral clarity in that, the kind that doesn't require an audience to function. And there's the matter of being right in a room full of people who came prepared to doubt you. Oliver Steed's question, in your assessment, was designed to reduce what she'd found to a matter of opinion. She didn't take the bait. She redirected to the data, offered to walk through every assumption and let the work answer for itself. That's not a trick. That's what happens when someone has done the real thinking, not the performance of thinking, and tell the difference in about 30 seconds. The room could tell. That's why it went quiet. I think about the Meridian memo sometimes, the one that sat in a filing system for 6 weeks. She had been right then too, and it hadn't mattered, not immediately, not until the numbers proved her right louder than anyone could ignore. She could have let that experience teach her cynicism. She didn't. She walked into Hartwell and did the same work, better, more thoroughly, and handed it to the people who needed to see it without softening a single sentence. That takes something that doesn't come from talent alone. Talent told her what was wrong. Character made her write it down anyway. Persistence made her sit in that room with Burton Marsh and Oliver Steed and not flinch. Dora built, quietly, over years, before anyone gave her a title or an office with a door, was a kind of integrity that compound interests over time. Every memo she wrote that was ignored, every room she walked into where the chair wobbled, every calculation she ran twice because she knew she wouldn't get the benefit of the doubt on the first. None of it disappeared. It accumulated. It became the 41 pages. It became the OBI protocol. A door with the tape on it doesn't get the last word. The work does.